Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event this evening. It's such a huge pleasure to see you all. Thanks for coming to this special and a bit different Green Alliance event. My name is Chris Venables. I'm Deputy Director of Politics and Partnerships at Green Alliance. If you don't know Green Alliance, we're a cross-party think tank focused on ambitious leadership for the environment. And it's really the core of that mission that brings us here this evening. So I'm really excited. I hope you are too. Before I try and introduce our speaker, which is a difficult task, I'd just like to thank those who supported this event. So thanks to Uplift, to WWF, Greenpeace, RSPB, the Network for Social Change, and the European Climate Foundation, without whom we wouldn't be able to run this and lots of our work wouldn't happen. So thank you to them. We're going to run until about 7:15 or 7:30, and then there'll be drinks and nibbles and lots of chance to talk about what you've heard this evening. So this is an event that's in our election series, the election countdown. We'd actually expected it to be a little bit later in the year. But this event has been in the diary for 6 months. So for anyone here from the Charity Commission or the Electoral Commission, please trust that was the case. We also hoped to have Ed Davey in a couple of weeks' time, but he pulled the event, something about being launched out of a cannon. Or was it a roller coaster or a bouncy castle? I can't quite remember. But just a serious point, Green Alliance is a non-partisan, cross-party charity. Thankfully, it shouldn't need saying, I suppose, that Caroline Lucas has worked in a cross-party way throughout her entire career and inspired many people, and many of whom are in this room, who work for others. Indeed, as I was chatting to lots of people preparing for this event, I spoke to a non-Green parliamentary candidate who got a bit of a telling off from their party HQ when they were asked on national radio who their political hero was, and they said, Caroline Lucas. Because who embodies the idea of political leadership on the nature and climate agenda, if not Caroline? I had the honour and the privilege to work with Caroline in Parliament several years ago. They say never meet your heroes. In this case, very much not true. It really was an incredible and amazing experience, and therefore even more of a privilege to introduce Caroline this evening several years later, as she steps down from her seat in the Commons. So what to say about Caroline before she offers her reflections, lessons, and challenge to all of us this evening? I mean, in many ways, there's no introduction that I could possibly give. But a memory popped into my mind as I was thinking about the event this evening. I was working in Parliament, and the government, as it likes to do every now and then, wanted to run a big PR campaign about its record on the environmental agenda. When Caroline found out about this, I sensed a bit of mischief in the air. We created some t-shirts, we spoofed the logo, and we made some flyers. We then walked down to the launch, the parliamentary launch of, I think, what was called Great Green Week. And most of the people entering the room looked slightly bemused and a little bit baffled by what we were doing. And then, round the corner, comes the, I will leave it unnamed, Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, who, upon seeing Caroline wearing the t-shirt and handing out the flyers, looked outraged and said, "Oh, Caroline, when will you stop being a protest movement and start being a parliamentarian?" What an awesome memory, and I suppose I just wanted to set that up this evening because obviously Caroline has been so much more than a parliamentarian and so much more than a protest movement, exactly whatever that means. And I know that she's made an extraordinary contribution to the work efforts of many of the people in this room. Of course, I hadn't quite realised that a job that was purely, from my perspective, like purely what I thought was a policy and political role would go a little bit further as an example of the work that Caroline did. And I had a few memories, for example, of carrying ginormous bird heads across the parliamentary estate to try and help the RSPB, or working with Possible to smuggle in a set of solar panels through security. We then had the gall to try and persuade the parliamentary post room that they were perfectly reasonable items to send to the offices of MPs who weren't where we were on the issue of onshore renewables. So, of course, alongside all of that, there was also the incredible work of pulling every imaginable lever in Parliament, the hours wrangling with the table office clerks, trying to get the most punchy questions through to ministers, the hours spent trying to strengthen and improve the reports of the Environmental Audit Committee, and amending every possible bill to try and make sure that climate and nature were in there. So, that's all by way of saying I was somewhat surprised when, about 6 months ago, I was chatting with Caroline, and we were discussing the to and fro of British politics. And Caroline at one point said, "But what have I really achieved?" And I suspect there's some people in this room who think that Caroline's maybe achieved more than a little. I suppose what I thought perhaps that Caroline was getting at, that we hadn't quite fixed everything. But I hope that it's clear from the people who've turned up today that there's a huge support for and vindication of the time that Caroline spent in Parliament. I hope this evening that I hope this evening that we mark in a small way the contribution, the hope, the inspiration, and the courage that Caroline has given to many of us. And I'm really glad that we have this moment, the people in this room, to hear the challenge and the critique as well about what we could do differently. So that's a small bit by way of introduction. Impossible to do justice to 14 years, and the examples I've shared are really the smallest ones. So please do put your hands together for Caroline Lucas, Member of Parliament for Brighton Pavilion 2010 to 2024.
Thank you so much. I think I might just go now. It's great. Thank you. I know what it feels like now to hear your own obituary and then you look around and you're still alive, which is a win-win. Thank you so much, Chris. That was such a lovely introduction, typically so. Thank you. And thank you all for being here today. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. It is so incredibly moving to see so many familiar faces. People who it's been just such an enormous privilege to get to know and work alongside over the past 14 years. And I am really so grateful to Green Alliance for giving me this opportunity to say my goodbyes, to express my thanks, and to share a few parting reflections with you all. So over the last couple of weeks since I've left Parliament, as you can imagine, I've obviously been out and about campaigning with the next generation of Green Party candidates standing in the election. And seeing them starting out on their own journeys, it's impossible not to think back to 2010, when I was in their shoes, pounding the pavements, knocking on doors, asking people to put their trust in me. And I'll never forget that first election night when I got onto the stage in Brighton in the early hours of the morning and heard the life-changing news that voters had made history and elected me as the first ever Green Party MP. And so many emotions ran through me that night, but principally it was a moment of sheer elation, not just for me, but for so many people across the country. No new party had made it into Parliament in decades. And the Greens had finally done it. We had a foot in the door at last. Despite all the odds that were stacked against us, despite our broken, closed shop of an electoral system, despite having to scrap for every last bit of media coverage, we had finally made it. And I say we advisedly because my election was the culmination of a monumental collective effort. Grassroots Green Party members and supporters, not just in Brighton, but from right across the country, put everything they had into canvassing and campaigning for me. My predecessor as candidate in Brighton Pavilion, the much-missed Keith Taylor, had worked hard for years and years to pave the way for the Greens to win the seat. And I couldn't have felt more humbled that this most special and independent-minded of cities had taken a leap of faith to put their trust in a new kind of party and a new kind of politics. So as I entered the House of Commons and walked those halls for the first time, I was acutely aware of just how much hope and frankly just how much expectation was resting on my shoulders. I was absolutely determined to do all I could to try to live up to that by doing things differently. Because I'd seen how Greens in other countries were changing the conversation by putting issues on the agenda that no one else was talking about. I'd seen how we could change the rules of politics by not being bound by precedent. And I'd seen how Greens achieved most when they set out to change not just the politics of the day, but the system and the power structures underlying them. My ambitions, even as a one-woman band, were high to do the same. Perhaps you could even say naively so. But then I was fresh out of the European Parliament, a place where I'd worked as part of a Green MEP family, where we leant across party lines to create better policy, where I could get my teeth into the details of legislation and change the laws that governed us. Cross-party collaboration and genuinely seeking to improve legislation was just the norm. And I stepped from that world into the toxic arena of Westminster political combat, an adversarial system of macho one-upmanship, where shouting each other down is the norm and political manoeuvres and dodges are standard procedure. In the last 14 years, I've witnessed a parliament mired in one scandal after another, from bullying and sexual harassment to government corruption on COVID contracts and Partygate, from the self-sabotage of Brexit and the extraordinary prorogation of Parliament, to the government's inhumane and illegal Rwanda proposals, or their reckless legislation to drive yet more exploitation of fossil fuels. I saw so much parliamentary time over the past 14 years dominated, or more accurately, squandered, on the most reactionary, regressive, and sometimes downright immoral of policies. And as political landscapes go, it is a fearsome one to try to have to navigate, let alone try to change, and all the more so as the lone Green MP, without a whip, having to understand the implications of every single vote, and needing to make an informed, evidence-based decision every time. The days and the nights have been long and challenging, and I won't deny at times the job has been frankly exhausting. But I also believe that it is the most important and worthwhile thing I will ever do. There'll be plenty more Green MPs in the UK, but I am proud to have been the first and to be part of what will be a long history. And what I want to acknowledge tonight is that without all of you, whether as individuals or as part of our expansive movement, I simply couldn't have done it. I just couldn't. So I want to give a very special thanks to all of the NGOs, all the activists, all the academics and dedicated journalists whose work and support and efforts I have depended on every single day. I think back to all of the last-minute briefings or advice on votes or help with lobbying other MPs or asking parliamentary questions or tabling motions, securing debates. I think of all the rallies and the protests and the campaigns to bring people together, of all of the opportunities that so many journalists have given me to speak out publicly and hold this government to account. If I have done this job even halfway effectively, I've done it standing on all of your shoulders. And even in the turmoil of the last 14 years, I think that together we have achieved something really significant. So this is a heartfelt thank you for the constant help and constant support of so many people and so many organisations in this room and so many more outside of it too. But this is also a moment for some lessons and some takeaways as well. Stepping down, I can't help but reflect on the seriousness of the climate and nature crisis we face. There is frankly a knot of fear in the pit of my stomach. The truth is that the climate crisis grows more urgent by the day, and every country, all of us, are way off track. Humanity, to quote the UN Secretary General, is on a highway to climate hell as we hurtle towards a global catastrophe of temperatures nearly 3 degrees warmer. So I believe that it is incumbent on all of us at such a juncture to take a hard look at everything that we, as a collective movement, can do to avert such disaster and mobilise the political action we urgently need to get back on track. So I'd like to spend the next few moments reflecting on the aims I started out with all the way back in 2010, to change the subject that was being talked about, to change the style and the rules of politics, and to start, at least, to change the system, and to assess how far we have, or in some cases haven't, come. So first then, did we succeed in changing the conversation over the past 14 years? Did we move the dial and change the narrative around the climate and nature crises? Did we even get the subject onto the agenda? Well, back in 2010, the Labour government had been trying to build new coal-fired power stations. A new runway at Heathrow was being planned. The fight against fracking hadn't yet begun. Meanwhile, the Tories had started their transition from hugging huskies to melting the poor dogs' homes. When David Cameron and Nick Clegg stood in the Rose Garden at number 10, environment was mentioned just once, and the word climate didn't pass their lips. The main agenda was the big society, big cuts, and a big bonfire of regulation. And it was in this context that I made my maiden speech, arguing that what Britain needed to do to make its fair contribution to addressing the climate crisis was year-on-year emission cuts of 10% until we got down to zero. My job, as I saw it then, was to be both a voice for social movements in the political mainstream and also someone who didn't budge when it came to climate science and the principle of equity. Yet simply making the case that Britain should be powered by renewables, not fossil fuels, was a daily battle. But we kept fighting, and together we have won some of the big battles too. The King's North coal-fired power station was never built. There is no third runway. Fracking never took off, and they never did sell off the forests. Together we found the ways to create a growing political platform for environmental issues. Year after year, I stood up in my corner of the chamber after the Chancellor's budget and asked the very same question each time. What about the climate? Why are you silent on that? And thanks to your support, I was able to table the leading amendment, for example, to improve the Environment Act, to set the tone and open the debate on the first dedicated piece of environmental legislation in 3 decades. I was able to push the government for ambitious outcomes at those vital summits at COP26 and COP15 and demand a space for MPs to challenge ministers. For COP26, my debate was in fact the only one in the chamber to focus on the objectives of the summit, and you lobbied and pressured and made sure MPs were prepared to attend. Just recently, with your help, I secured and led a debate on the national scandal that is our biodiversity crisis, with the UK now famously one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. Together, we have used every tool and every trick in the parliamentary book to put and then keep our issues high on the political agenda. And I've tried my best to get them in the media and onto the public's agenda too. And as an MP, I suddenly had a platform like never before. And slowly at first, and then quite quickly, things did begin to change. We went from an era where Cameron, as Prime Minister, could dare to dismiss environmental concerns as green crap, to an era where net zero is now a legally binding commitment, and we managed to build a cross-party consensus to such an extent that Parliament came together to declare a climate emergency. And as depressing as it is to see the Tories now setting light to that consensus in their desperate lurch to the hard right, I don't think we should underestimate just how much collectively over the last 14 years we have in fact succeeded in changing the conversation. Now, I'm under no illusion that that was down to my efforts as one lone voice, but I do think it's down to the efforts of so many voices in our movement that has grown and grown, and because people took action in the face of the fossil fuel lobby and in the face of a politics that didn't care. And it's no longer just specialist environmental groups speaking out. It's not just left-wing or right-wing, young or old. It's the whole of our society coming together to exert pressure on the government to act. It's scientists raising their voices, lawyers taking action, artists raising awareness, activists taking to the streets, school students walking out. I particularly remember one school strike that was joined by 1 million students in 125 countries across the world. When I stood on the top of a fire engine that was parked outside of Parliament and looked at a sea of young faces demanding change and justice. And I think that was the precise moment, 5 years ago now, that I knew that things were changing. It was a moment of uprising, and the climate crisis was not to be denied. Those waging an unforgivably reckless culture war on net zero and climate action as the political wing of the fossil fuel industry may be intent on rolling back the clock, and Labour, for all their talk of change, may still be far from fully grasping this agenda. On climate change, for example, they rode back on the flagship 28 billion of annual investment, without which it will be almost impossible to meet our climate targets. They've dodged the difficult questions like on airport expansion and eating less meat. They're almost completely missing in action on the biodiversity crisis. Indeed, it took a full-on lobbying campaign just to get them to match the current government's position. The arc of progress does not, it is true, run straight. But if politicians are faltering right now and pedaling backwards, the general public are not. The environment is consistently ranked as one of the top 5 priorities for voters. For many young people in particular, it's the most important issue of all. People want clean air and water and lower energy bills. They want livable homes on a livable planet. The conversation has changed for good. The environment is a core mainstream political issue, inextricably linked to social and economic issues too. So why, you might wonder, does polling for the Wildlife Trusts out just last week find that most people think the main parties aren't showing anything like sufficient leadership? Well, partly perhaps because while we have changed the subject on climate, I think we've had less success on other environmental issues. We know that if everyone in the world consumed natural resources at the same rate as we in the north, then 3 planets would be needed to supply the resources and to absorb the wastes. And yet resource use is too often only whispered by the environmental movement in conversations with power for fear of being shut out or sounding too radical. We know that if our strategy is to always meet the conversation where it's at, we'll fail. In a similar vein, we know that we can't meet our 2050 climate targets without a real and significant shift in what we eat and in the way that we travel. Yet those simple truths often seem underplayed. Indeed, the date of 2050 itself is far too late for an industrialized country like the UK. We need to do far more to respect the principle that lies at the heart of the Paris Agreement, of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. It might be politically inconvenient to admit it, but it's also scientifically and morally necessary. So our conversation has got to get a lot broader, and we also need to focus on some of the other pillars upon which meaningful change is based. And that brings me to whether we've successfully changed the rules of politics. So I hope that no one could accuse me of not trying to do things differently, from wearing that No More Page 3 t-shirt in the chamber, for which I was roundly scolded by Parliament's authorities, to sitting with protesters in Balcombe and being arrested by police as we stood together against fracking. It's why I've never stopped challenging the way Parliament is run, from the absurd way that bill committees are conducted with no intention of even trying to actually improve legislation, or to the obscure way that amendments were written in language that no one understands and with no explanation. I knew that as the only Green MP, I'd be placed under a microscope, judged perhaps more harshly than my peers. So I chose to make a virtue of not being prepared to follow the rules, chose to very deliberately model a different way of doing politics, to work cross-party to get things done, even if that meant working with some unlikely bedfellows, to unequivocally call out what I saw as wrong, whether that was by tearing up the illegal migration bill in a parliamentary debate, or challenging Amber Rudd during the 2019 election TV debates about how she slept at night, knowing that UK arms were raining down on Yemeni civilians. A politics committed to not just representing the millions of voices clamouring for something different, but also to actively raising those voices up and making sure that they get heard in Parliament. A politics characterised by carefully putting forward hard evidence and thoughtful communication that would change people's minds and earn their trust as well. Because standing up for the science matters, the facts matter, the evidence matters, and how we speak that truth matters most of all. So I will try to speak the truth now as I see it, and I hope you will forgive my honesty. Because as I stand here 14 years on from when I was first elected at Westminster, at the same time as recognising all that we have achieved together, I am also disappointed that we didn't do more to change the rules of politics. That with, of course, some very honourable exceptions, our movement all too often still chooses to play by those rules, to focus on small incremental wins and defending against backsliding, rather than focusing on the overall direction of travel. Maybe to value having a seat around the table over speaking truth to power, to overlook radical analysis of the interconnected nature of the challenges we face in favour of short-term fixes, to keep a distance from rebels and rule breakers, and instead to play it safe. Friends, I believe that the current political rules are an obstacle to securing a livable future, and that until the rulebook is thrown up and torn up, we must all be alert to the possibility that, rather than being the agents for the real change to which we all aspire, we are in fact colluding in maintaining the status quo. I remember one of my greatest fears after becoming an MP was being institutionalised. I particularly recall Margaret Beckett taking me aside after one particularly bad procedural outrage, and she said to me, "Don't worry, you'll get used to it." And I promise you I never have, or maybe just a little. But I leave feeling that one of the things I'm most proud of is of resisting that institutionalization and that getting used to it every day. The rules of politics are there to be broken. If we're to make more progress in the next 14 years than we have in the last 14, then rather than being dictated to by the rule makers, we all have to become rule breakers too. Whether that's by backing political reform to break up the power of the two-party system, or supporting those who put their bodies on the line in the climate fight, or organising within communities that have been held back by a failing government. Let's do the hard thing that we often struggle with on our side of politics. Seek allies in our struggles rather than trying to find enemies in our midst. Let's all commit to spending less time talking to each other on Twitter and more time talking to people who are yet to be persuaded. And for the environment sector, that could also mean NGOs being more ready to sometimes drop their brands and logos to work together in a more deeply collaborative way. For those doing the inside work, it means properly recognising the importance of the vocal radical flanks, and of course, vice versa. Realising the power that you all have to genuinely shift politics. So let's always look to break power up, not just to find ways to infiltrate it. Let's be prepared to admit that a change of government is simply not enough, that business as usual means environmental devastation, that another decade of playing by the rules will leave the majority in our country and our world poorer, less safe, and further from power. And that leads me really to the final question I've been asking myself. Have we changed the system and the power structures? The UK is at its very core, I believe, a nation of nature lovers. We're united by that vision of a green and pleasant land. Millions of us join the National Trust or the RSPB or the Woodland Trust, or we tune into Springwatch and Countryfile. David Attenborough has more moral authority than all the MPs in the land rolled into one. And yet somehow, that love of our natural world doesn't protect or restore it. It doesn't command and compel our politicians to act. And one reason I would suggest is that we're still allowing one narrative to dominate political discourse, namely that our prosperity is defined not by our health and well-being or that of the environment around us, but by the unending quest for GDP growth and corporate power. It has become an overriding, all-consuming, all-destroying national obsession of British politics. And it will never change unless we dismantle that corrosive mentality that sets economic expansion as the goal above all others. And it will never change either until we find much more compelling stories of who we are as a nation, of who we could be, and of what's really important to us. And that weighs most heavily of all on me. Because I think the answer is so clearly that we haven't changed the system or the power structures yet. Yes, the transition away from fossil fuels is happening, but not anywhere like fast enough. And it's the poorest people who will pay the biggest price if we fail to have a smooth and managed transition. There is no route out of this mess, no way to convince the majority of people of the need for bold action, and no way to seriously address the triple crisis of climate, nature, and inequality without transforming the economic system and the political system that we're living in. If you're in any doubt, then just take a look at the most recent European elections and the rise of the far right. We can see what happens when fear is whipped up among a population who've been at the sharp end of economic decline. It isn't just Green parties that are at risk, it's our very democracy which will break if we don't do things differently. And this, frankly, should also serve as a stark warning to a particularly timid Labour Party as well. If you don't rise to this moment with bold policies and, crucially, a properly, fully resourced transition, if you don't rethink the fiscal straitjacket that you have chosen to strap yourselves into, you might win the next election, but you risk setting the table for a resurgent far right. And friends, this isn't just a critique of corporate capitalism. It is a practical challenge. We cannot expect the majority of people to back the changes we need unless those very changes are redistributive of both money and power. We won't succeed in averting the worst of climate chaos unless we urgently mobilize and redistribute vast flows of finance on a national and global scale. We can't be saying to people that we need to change their heating systems without guaranteeing that the costs of that change will be borne by us collectively and paid for by those who have the most. Any more than we can ask the poorest and most climate-vulnerable countries in the world to suffer the worst impacts, as we, one of the richest nations in the world, with all of our historic industrial emissions and special responsibility for helping to cause this crisis, while we haver over whether we'll even do the barest minimum of getting to net zero by 2050. But I feel that when I've stood up to talk about things like climate justice and our special, historic, moral responsibility to act, or when I've made the point that net zero by 2050 is nothing like good enough and that we need to go much faster, or when I question fundamental political issues like the quest for economic growth that has destroyed our natural world, on these big but vital and unavoidable questions about our power structures and our economic systems, I have, frankly, often felt like a lonely voice, without collective cover and policy support to demonstrate how it could be done. Whilst I was putting my head above the parapet, it did sometimes seem to me that some of you were keeping your heads down in damage limitation mode. And I understand that instinct, I really do. But I also know that at such a serious moment in human history, We can't afford to settle for anything less than what the science demands. We can't back away any longer from taking on and changing the system and the power structures that enable it. And we can't talk about funding the change that we desperately need without plans to properly tax wealth and redistribute it. Friends, we urgently need to close the gap between what's scientifically and ethically essential and what is currently deemed to be politically possible. All of the environment's warning signs are flashing red, as you know. And failure is not an option, as you well know too. And this decade, this next Parliament is the critical one. Because if not now, then when? Friends, as the wonderful Arundhati Roy writes, we know that another world is not only possible, she is on her way. And if you listen very carefully, you can hear her breathing. The next 14 years will determine whether her arrival is orderly or chaotic, whether it perpetuates inequality or is an opportunity for a great reset. And I hope that you'll be there with a whole group of Green MPs to greet her alongside you. And it is with hope that I want to close. Active, radical hope is where I began this journey, and it's been my constant companion. None of us really know what makes change happen. In truth, it's not one thing or another, not one organization or one campaign. It is the cumulative impact of a multitude of positive actions, of courage, ambition, and determination. It's a movement which is rich in its diversity, in which we all play our part. And it is always hope that shoves us out the door. It is an enormous privilege to have been the Green MP for Brighton Pavilion, to have this opportunity to share my thoughts with you tonight and to feel hopeful about what's next. The next 14 years will count as no others, and you must be fearless in all that you do. Be bold in your actions, take risks, keep your eyes on the big changes you want to see. That's how to keep changing the conversation, that's how to keep changing the rules, and that's how, ultimately, to change the system. That is what we need, real hope and real change. Thank you all so much.
Before we get into the big challenge and the difficult, crunchy things of strategy and grand politics, I also thought it might be a nice moment to reflect on some of the behind the scenes of politics, which you don't always see, and which make up such a big part of how you spent your time. I wonder if you could tell us about a few of your more strange experiences in the House of Parliament.
Well, there are so many, and as I was reflecting on them, weirdly, so many of them have to do with those Brexit years. But I remember, for example, being in the green room with Hugh Grant, which was sort of nervously enough, which was just before the MAR programme on a Sunday morning. So I was already feeling quite nervous, because what you do with small chat with Hugh Grant. But then John Major came sort of flying through the door and said how much he'd agreed with absolutely everything I'd said on any questions 2 days earlier. And so I was in quite a conundrum as to whether or not to feel worried about that or to feel sort of warmly grateful for it. I've also been reminded of a case that I don't actually remember myself, but I've seen the photographic evidence to show that it did happen, which was that I was approached apparently by David Cameron and Harriet Harman to join them in Asda. And the reason for this was because they wanted to demonstrate that Brexit was going to cause all kinds of economic problems to people's weekly shop, and what better thing to do than have a photo call with Harriet Harman, David Cameron and myself in Asda. I can promise you I didn't go, but I do think it sheds quite an interesting light on perhaps why we lost the referendum. that was the thing. And then I suppose the other thing, just to remember, was some bizarre meetings that we had in Jeremy Corbyn's office when he was leader of the Labour Party. So there'd be Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and some of his other frontbenchers, and we were supposed to be strategizing about how to get a people's vote, essentially. Yeah. And the whole conversation every single week was always about biscuits. It's not untrue. It was all about who's going to buy the biscuits, which biscuits do people want, and again. I feel
like we're learning a few things here.
We didn't win the people's vote either. So lessons to be learned.
Good.
Bring your own biscuits.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's so many more of those, but it's so nice to hear a few snippets. So I guess kind of building on from that, what those were the strange experiences. What surprised you the most thinking back to when you first entered Parliament about how it worked or didn't?
I think I had underestimated its dysfunctionality. I mean, I wasn't under any illusion that it was going to be some kind of, you know,
paradise of advocacy.
Exactly. But just how dysfunctional, but also how it was actually sort of set up to fail in a way. I mean, I'm thinking about the bill committees that you'll know get set up after the government announces a new piece of legislation, and a temporary bill committee is set up, and obviously it reflects the political complexion of the Parliament. But I never really properly realised that actually there was no intention of the government trying to get better legislation out of that process. They literally do just want the same legislation to go in at one end, and for people to spend weeks and weeks deliberating, and then for the same legislation to come out the other end without it having changed a jot. And, you know, you'll remember that sort of story of Sarah Wollaston, who was the Tory MP for Totnes, and she was the one MP, I think, who was actually chosen through a process of an open primary. So basically, anybody in Totnes could vote for who should be the Conservative MP for that area. It was a David Cameron wheeze in the days when he was kind of thinking outside the box, but it led to such a kind of fiery and independent-minded MP. He never tried it again, but Sarah Wollaston, as you might recall, was a doctor, a GP, and that was one of the reasons people were so glad to see her go to Parliament. And she asked her whip, so the story goes, if she could sit on the bill committee that was going to be looking at the Andrew Lansley Health and Social Care bill, you know. Yeah. And they said, no, you've got to go and sit on the committee for double taxation in the Cayman Islands. And when she protested that she knew nothing of that said subject, the answer was simply, well, that's great, because all we want you to do is put up your hand and we tell you. And that just kind of encapsulated just how there's no intent to make good legislation, you know, and so it's not surprising that it doesn't, and that's before we even get to the weirdnesses of prorogation, of trying to hold Boris Johnson to account, or to hold account any Prime Minister, frankly, who takes it into their head just to simply rip up I don't know if you can rip up an unwritten code. You probably can't, can you, come to think about it? But you know what I mean, to metaphorically rip up the rules and basically to abuse the position. And we tried every single way we could to work out how we could stop him lying from the dispatch box. You know, we wrote to the procedure committee, we wrote to the speaker, we liaised with the other party leaders to try to see if there could be some way that we could find some lever that could stop this happening, to which the answer was no. So away he went, and still he does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure that resonates on, particularly on the bill side, with lots of people in this room who've tried amending them over the years. What was your biggest takeaway then from Parliament? What's the thing that you're going to be kind of leaving with at the biggest sense of?
Yeah, well, I suppose it is that we just need to break it up in the sense of breaking up, not literally, but, well, maybe, but about the political system and the way in which our two-party system is just so stifling of new ideas and of a fresh way of approaching things, and of any hope, really, of dealing with the existential crisis that we face at the moment. It just feels like it is uniquely ill-equipped to deal with those kinds of issues. And, of course, you expect me as a Green Party member to want to change the voting system, to get a fairer voting system. But it is a first step, I think, to be able to hear those wider voices, those broader voices coming up from different directions, and then to try to make some more interesting coalitions within that to get stuff done, rather than just having this adversarial way of doing things, which, you know, where people are basically just grandstanding to make their points, and not enough of that coalition building is going on.
Yeah. And despite all of that, I suppose, and obviously I mentioned a few of them in an introduction, but they were very small ones, you did achieve a huge amount. So it'd be lovely to hear a few of the things that perhaps you're most proud of.
Yeah, well, so unfortunately, as a single MP, I can't swing majorities, so I can't point to any votes that I can claim were as a result of my work. But I mean, I suppose I was going to answer it in two ways. One is I am proud of the constituency work. I am proud of being re-elected 4 times, and each time with a bigger majority. And I think it did show that you can break into this system and do things a bit differently and still get re-elected. Yeah. And so, doing that work for our constituents and making sure that they were front and centre and the basis upon which everything else was built was and is really important and something I feel proud of. And I suppose in terms of tangible things, working with Mary Colwell, I don't know if she is lurking in the audience somewhere. She is in the front row, no less. It was her idea, but essentially it was the idea of this GCSE in natural history. And that's come to mean more to me, actually, as the years have gone by, because it does just strike me that Richard Louv was right when he wrote in that book, Last Child in the Wood, that we won't protect what we don't love, and we won't love what we don't know, and we won't know what we don't hear and touch and smell and feel and everything else. And to ensure that our young people do have access to that intimacy with and that familiarity with the natural world feels so essential. We know it already from the perspective of mental health or physical health, but the way in which it might also be a key to kind of mobilizing people to protect and restore the natural world with greater fierceness, I suppose, it feels even more important to me for that reason. And we hope that the GCSE will go forward. All of you in this room, if you can make it your number one priority to lobby Bridget Phillipson on the first day of the Labour government, because we need to make sure Labour will carry it on. But the Tories did agree to it, and that I was very proud of. Yeah,
excellent. Well, that's all of your takeaway action point from this evening. We've now invited a few people to ask questions. And then we'll open it up, so perhaps we might just lift the lights slightly. And we'll take those in 2. So first, Chris Stark, who's now the Chief Executive of the Carbon Trust, but before that, the head of the Committee on Climate Change.
Hi, Caroline. It's Chris here. I'm formerly of the CCC, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight. Can I just first of all say, for all of us who work on climate, you are an absolute inspiration. It has been a genuine pleasure working with you. And I want to just qualify that. It's not just because you're a Green MP, it's because you're interested. So for those of us who work on the analysis and the numbers, having someone in Parliament who actually listened is a real novelty. Let's hope we have a Parliament that has more of those shortly. I remember when we gave the advice on the net zero target, being very nervous coming to see you because the date was 2050 and not an earlier date, and I could see the disappointment in your face. And I remember leaving that room thinking I better say at the latest every time I talked about it, and that is duly what I've done since. I wanted to just ask you a question about climate politics, if I can. And in particular, this rise of populism, people who have easy answers to stuff. And that seems to me where we are now, is that you can offer any old answer to the question of what we do about climate change. You can say it's volcanoes and people nod at that stage and don't move on. What do you think we need to do about that? And in particular, what do you think we should do to try and re-inject some of the positive discussion and the energy into this to those people who aren't going to respond to the analysis in the way that you do? What's your answer to that question? It seems to me the big challenge for the next 10 years and more.
Thank you, Chris. And then we'll take a question from Mary Colwell, who's over there. Just over there, Holly. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Caroline, you are so emotional to listen to. And to hear you talk about the dysfunctional nature of Parliament, just doesn't it ring true? Did you notice that when you and I did things together, did you hear all that rose-tinted glass shattering everywhere I walked? Because when I first met you and you sent that wonderful message on Twitter saying, hope you don't mind me contacting you, can I help you with the GCSE in natural history? Do I mind? I thought there was a system. I thought that it was just a matter of a system, and you got into it and things would happen. It doesn't work like that, does it? And even so, yes, the Conservative Party did say yes to the GCSE, but even so, it's still stuck in some side eddy that won't be released. So thank you for sticking with it, and thank you for sticking with me, even when I got a bit heated at times. But I think I want to ask the question, you're leaving, but will you still stick with me, and we'll just get it through, and we'll get an A level, and we'll get degrees, and we'll get nature right into the heart of the whole of society. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary. Over to you, Caroline.
Well, let me respond to Mary first. What I love about Mary is that every time you take 1 inch in her direction, she's suddenly set the bar quite a lot higher, which is good. That's how you get things done. It's been an honour and privilege working with you, Mary. And of course, you won't keep me away from this. I mean, I was serious when I kind of said that it does feel more personal to me now, this whole issue about love of the natural world. And in a way, that's why I'm standing back, because being the front bench spokesperson on absolutely bloody everything is exhausting. And I want to focus on nature and climate. And seeing this followed through, seeing what we can do through the education system and properly embedding it there and making the distinction between the sciences that we're already studying with biology, looking at the systems, whereas this is about actually looking at the individual flora and fauna and naming it and knowing it and loving it. I just feel so motivated by that, so try and stop me, don't just, that would be amazing. And to Chris's question, well, thank you for your kind words, and I'm very glad to know that the at the latest was a direct. I can chalk that up as my second achievement. I mean, you will know the answer. I mean, you'll have thought about this a heck of a lot, but I suppose my only answer would be around properly putting social justice and fairness at the heart of absolutely everything, and demonstrating that the actions that we need to take are about creating a better world. I mean, I know that's a cliche, but it is about that. And it does worry me that at the moment, that whole social justice dimension and the fairness dimension isn't sufficiently embedded, and it certainly won't be embedded if we're not serious about funding this transition. And I see the lovely Laura Sands in the audience, and Laura and I worked together, first of all with Ed Miliband and then with Hilary Benn, with the IPPR on a commission for environmental justice. And it was all about how there will be no green transition unless it's a fair one, because ordinary people have a veto on this stuff. They can just stop it happening by voting for something different. And so it is about, taking people with us. We in that IPPR commission, we made it an absolute condition of our engagement that there would be citizens' assemblies, juries that went on for actually weeks and weeks in different parts of the country as we properly listened to people about what would make it easier to make that transition. And it was genuinely, through the kind of sortition process, so that they were not people who were already minded to be interested in this subject. So I think it is about that, bringing people with us and properly funding it. We cannot allow ourselves any examples of where a transition has happened on the back of the poorest people. And that means serious money on the table. And that takes us right back into the debates that I was trying to hint at in my talk, really, that even people who are working on a much more narrow environmental agenda do need to care about a wealth tax. You do need to care about a redistribution of funds. Otherwise, this is simply not going to happen. It just isn't. So that joined upness has got to be something, surely, that we take away for the next 14 years, because we haven't got it right in the last 14.
Thank you, Caroline. And thank you, Mary and Chris, for your questions. Next, I have Alistair Driver from Rewilding UK and Tessa Khan.
Hi, Caroline. Great to see you, and a fantastic speech. And I wanted to start with an anecdote. You and I met on the tube a year or so ago, and I got off the tube, and a guy got off with me, and he just said, "That lady is an excellent politician." So, man in the street is with you.
It's probably my husband.
Also, I wanted to thank you personally for all the great support you've given us over the years. Way back when I was in the Environment Agency, the support on natural flood management was really pivotal. It matters a lot to people like me who are sort of beavering away, trying to make policy happen from within big organisations, that we know we've got people who will listen and understand, and we know you're out there batting for us when it matters. And it's hugely important to our own moral feeling of well-being, and that moral support is fundamentally important. So thank you for that. My question relates to the need for step change. As you know, I'm Director of Rewilding Britain, and we're gradually gathering momentum for rewilding as an option in the countryside, an option which brings hope for biodiversity and climate change mitigation. But we desperately need this step change. And one of the things, in fact, the biggest thing that's getting in the way of that is the vested interests in the farming lobby. Now, it's in the interests of farming and farmers that we make this step change, because otherwise they have no future. But how do we break this stranglehold that the NFU and others have over government at the moment, which is preventing significant change from happening?
Well, I just looking around this room, I can see so many people who are so much better equipped to answer that question than I am. So I hope you'll forgive this is not a terribly in-depth answer. But it does feel to me as if, again, to continue a theme, that farmers won't come with us unless there's enough resource in the right pots of money to enable farmers to make transitions towards a better way of taking care of the land. And as far as I can see it, that there isn't enough money, for example, in the landscape recovery pot, and there is too much in the kind of business as usual pot, the sustainable farming initiative. So, I mean, a lot of it is going to come down to finances, I think, because farmers generally, and correct me if there are lots of farmers in the room, but I think they generally do what they are asked to do and paid to do. They will work to the rules that are set, and it can't be a surprise that if we haven't set the right rules, then we don't get the right results. So I think it is about making sure that that finance is there. I mean, I guess it's a circular argument, because then you're going to ask me, well, if the NFU isn't asking for that, how do we get the government to provide the money in the right place? And maybe it comes down to more of us making that more of a priority. I mean, when you think about the biggest environmental issues that we face, it always worries me that farming tends to be quite low on people's list of priorities, and yet farming and the way we treat our land is responsible for so much. You know, when we look about rivers and the issues of pollution in the rivers, all of the focus is on sewage, and that's because it's kind of disgusting and it's an easy thing to kind of focus on. But we know that a huge amount of it is to do with the nitrates, the phosphorus, and all of the other things that are linked to an over-focus on intensive agriculture. And yet that far less regularly gets part of the debate. So I think it's partly about the money and partly trying to change the debate on that.
Thanks, Caroline. Next up is Tessa Khan, Director of Uplift. Thanks, Tessa.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you so much, Caroline. I often say to colleagues that I've been following you, not physically following you, to be clear.
Someone else on the tube.
I've been inspired by you long before I moved to the UK, in case there was ever any question about your global celebrity and the huge reach of your leadership. And it's been such a privilege recently to support your leadership of the Climate Change All-Party Parliamentary Group, and in general your leadership in the fight for a faster, fairer transition from fossil fuels. Caroline, in your remarks you touched on the need for deeper collaboration in the climate movement, which does feel crucial. I suppose as we approach having a more progressive government, there's a risk that closer to power perhaps, we may, as a movement, start to focus more of our energy on challenging each other internally and narrowing our alliances rather than broadening them and focusing on the structures and the institutions we really need to change. So how do we make sure that we do focus our energy on the real problems, like the fossil fuel industry, instead of each other?
Small question.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your kind words and for your incredible leadership at Uplift. I mean, it's just been so inspiring to work with you on that all-party group, so thank you for that. And your question is so to the point, and I don't know that I've got lots of good answers, but I certainly think it's the right question, which is that is an important thing to identify. For me, of course, it's going to be about trying to keep our eyes on the big picture and not let ourselves be deflected by incremental change that is not enough. And I think more than ever, it's going to have to be the case that we are quite rigorous with each other and try and keep that focus on the big change that needs to happen and not let ourselves get fobbed off by very, very small steps, because we haven't got time for very, very small steps. And I mean, I know there are endless meetings that happen, and Chris, you will tell me that probably Green Alliance hosts most of them, but there are endless meetings that bring different parts of the movement together to understand one another better, to work out how to be better coordinated. And so I hesitate to suggest you do more of that. Okay. But somehow, surely it is about understanding the different roles that we have. I'm not suggesting that everybody in the room has the same strategy and the same tactics and the same role. We all have different roles to play. But somehow, sometimes it doesn't always seem as joined up as it might have done. And sometimes perhaps we haven't always thought the best of each other in the different roles that we're playing. It's been too easy to try to think, well, someone's sold out here, or someone hasn't pushed hard enough there, or they've pushed too hard. So I think there is something about making sure that our ducks are in a row, and that we understand each other's positions, and to the extent possible, have a more ambitious and joined-up strategy that does really get ready to push this next Labour government. Because on the one hand, you're quite right, perhaps it does mean that with the potential possibilities that are there, it will become more easy for us to kind of turn on one another and say, you know, is that enough or is it not enough? But at the same time, it is a huge opportunity to have, you know, someone like Ed Miliband in some of those important places is really good, it's really important. But it means that we have to push them and make sure that we never let up on that. And Green MPs, I think, are more vital than ever, precisely to make sure that people like Ed have got a bit more support on his external flanks, if that's not an odd metaphor, to make them bolder and braver and better to do this stuff. And that I think is kind of an exciting prospect as well as one that we need to be careful that we treat well.
I obviously really agree with that. Okay, a couple more from the floor and then we'll open it up. So Ruth Chambers from Green Alliance, and then Richard Benwell if he's here, although I can't actually see him. He's there at the back. Hello, Richard.
Thanks so much. Caroline, I never thought I'd hear myself saying these words, but forget Taylor Swift. This is the hottest ticket in town tonight. And I don't know if thank yous have a collective noun, but I hope that by the end of this evening you've got a whole murmuration of thank yous. Certainly from Green Alliance's perspective and from Greener UK, the coalition that we ran, your support in Parliament during those Brexit years, as you called them, was hugely immense. And, you know, the changes that you were managing to achieve behind the scenes were just incredible. And Chris has just asked me to give 4 super speedy examples just to bring that to life. And then I've got a really short question. So the first is, you mentioned in your brilliant speech setting the tone for an Environment Bill debate and being the first MP to kick off that debate with an amendment. And that sounds important, but actually it was crucially important because that was the day that the Environment Bill returned to Parliament after being lost during COVID. And during that time, we had a DEFRA Secretary of State that wanted to change it, and not in a good way. So setting that positive tone was really important. But it wasn't guaranteed, because it's quite tricky, especially for a lone MP, to get that hallowed first slot. And how did you do it? Well, one thing that happened, and we helped a little bit with an amendment, is Olivia, sitting next to me, basically hot-footed it, because you can't email and say, I want to be number 1 in the queue. You physically got to be number 1 in the queue. And thanks to Olivia, you got that spot, you did that debate, you set the tone, and that really helped with those ensuing debates. Number 2, something you haven't mentioned, I don't think, which is your membership and the leadership that you showed in the Environmental Audit Committee, which is a crucial scrutineer of government policy and really a shining light of how Parliament can hold ministers to account. Behind the scenes, you were always there, asking excellent questions of witnesses, strengthening recommendations in reports, encouraging the committee to reopen inquiries. The list goes on, really, but I think the role that you played in that committee was just brilliant. Number 3, the power of the PQ. I don't think anyone has mastered the art of asking parliamentary questions and getting answers as well as you've done. Quite often it's really easy to be fobbed off. But if you're fobbed off, a bit like Mary, you just keep coming back for more. And eventually government ministers relent. So thank you for all of those PQs that you managed to get over the line. And I think the last one is really an example of where you combined your brilliant parliamentary insight and expertise in biodiversity with maybe your mischievous streak as well. And it's when the nature target, so the 2030 target, was being brought into law by one of those small, obscure committees that you mentioned. But what most MPs don't know is that any MP can turn up to those debates when it's about a statutory instrument, and that's what you did. And when you opened the door, because we were watching live on Parliament TV, you could see the minister's face drop as if to say, what is Caroline doing here? And the chair of the committee had to turn to the clerk, the officer of the Commons, and say, my goodness, this has never happened before. What do we do now? And it meant that you brought a real kind of sense of urgency into that debate, and it wasn't just done in a box-ticking way. I could go on, but so many examples, and thank you. My question is... If we had a magic portal, and if politics were different, and if in 5 weeks' time you became DEFRA Environment Secretary, what would you do first?
Well, thank you first of all for your incredibly kind words, and I mean, you've just been such a fantastic person to work with, and always, at any time, day or night pretty much, you've always been there to help, so thank you so very much. And also your lovely examples give me the opportunity of thanking my extraordinary staff, many of whom are here tonight. There's Kath Miller in the front row over there, and Olivia sitting next to Ruth. I think Sarah, my press officer, is kind of a couple of seats behind as well. So I just want to thank, and you all know Chris, and Matthew in the front row over there will know, these are survivors of my office, that, you know, none of this is possible without the extraordinary work of my amazing team. So thank you so much, because I sit here and get all the thanks, and actually they do all the hard work. So that's great. The question, I recommend it. The question was, well, I want to be the Chancellor. I'm really pissed off with being at DEFRA. I mean, come on. Because you know, at the moment, as you know, if I'm the DEFRA Secretary, then I'm going to be going cap in hand the whole time to the Chancellor to do anything. So I want to be the Chancellor. So I will object to being the DEFRA Secretary. I mean, well, I'll sort out the farming first. I'll sort out the farming first. But then again, I'm going to need the money from the bloody Chancellor, aren't I? So I mean, I think we could get rid of perverse subsidies. That would be a very good start while I'm the Chancellor. And then doing things like internalising the external costs so that the environmentally good thing to do is also the cheapest thing to do. That could make a massive difference. So yeah, I'm going straight for the Treasury, and I'm not going to be fobbed off.
Lovely stuff. Richard Benwell from Wildlife and Countryside Link, and then we'll open it up. Yes.
Thanks, Olivia, Kath, and Caroline. And thanks, Green Alliance, for setting up tonight. It was almost impossible to think of the one moment to mention. You could have thought of the time that you took a chance on young researchers at the RSPB to bring in a Green Party motion for an environment bill with legally binding targets and nature mapping 7 years before the government thought of it. It could have been the moment you brought in that amendment for the legally binding target in the Environment Act itself. It could have been the brilliant fun we had during lockdown when you had us reading the Lorax as an excuse for talking about moving away from GDP. Fantastic, a bright moment in those dark days. But I just wanted to remember one moment that probably you won't recall and that might give people another side. You spoke in your remarks about the sort of horrible institutions sometimes of Parliament, and there really is a food chain in there, and it goes from very high to very low, and perhaps some of my former colleagues will agree that at the very bottom of the food chain are the baby clerks. Once I was one of those and had made a really stupid mistake. I can't remember what it was. I'd crossed off the wrong name or something on a list, and I'd chased after an MP, and I'd run into them and drawn on their suit with a permanent marker. It was for a first job out of university. It was a devastating moment for somebody who wanted to please. And in that state I was in, I don't know whether you'd seen what happened.
I can't imagine where the story is going. But
well, I don't know whether you'd seen what happened, but you came across and had a chat. And it really it really made a difference, and you could really tell a lot about parliamentarians from the way that they behaved in the lobby, where you were basically a supermarket checkout person, and some people paid attention as if you were a human, and others charged through as if you were a machine. And that day, when you stopped to talk and said, "How are you doing?" and then talked about whatever the business was that day, and you said, "Oh gosh, I really hope we get this one," I just thought, oh gosh, here's somebody who cares about what's actually going on in Parliament, cares about the issues, and somebody who's got the time to take out to talk to a young person who, doesn't mean anything in the day. And that was such a special, a meaningful moment, and maybe gives people a glimpse of behind the scenes things that really do matter. So thank you for that. In terms of a question, very quickly, it's called Reflections and Lessons, and you spoke in your remarks about how you wish that sometimes we had been a bit braver about popping up from the parapet. So I guess the question for you is, what didn't we give you as a movement that would have helped over the last 14 years, so that when that next generation come through and we're trying to help them to break down party lines, to be braver about reimagining what success looks like, not to be fobbed off with the small things, what can we give them that you didn't have in those moments of need?
Well, thank you for your lovely comments. And I wonder if that mark came out of the person's suit. I hope it did. Well, I think two ways of answering your question. And I suppose the role of Green MPs, it feels to me at least, in this system when there aren't a great number of us, is to try to broaden that Overton window, to try to broaden the definition of what's politically possible. And that's a long and slow process. But one of the ways of doing that is to broaden the number of options that are on the order paper for people to vote on. Even if you know perfectly well that amendment is perhaps not even going to be selected, it certainly isn't going to be voted on. But it's still important to have it there in order to be able to begin to shift the centre of gravity of the debate, if you like, in a more green direction. And I did sometimes feel that because, the job of many NGOs would be measured much more in how many amendments do you successfully get through, rather than have you changed the parameters of the debate, then the focus I felt very often from environmental NGOs was just like, well, is this amendment going to get through or not? And if it's not going to get through, we're not going to waste our time drawing up some, abstract amendment that could in some other parallel universe get through, but it ain't going to go through now. And I think there was a lack of, well, maybe not a lack of, but a difference of understanding about whether it was important to, at the same time, yes, of course, have those amendments that stand a chance of getting through and making those incremental changes, of course. But at the same time, I don't think that's mutually exclusive to putting some of those more ambitious, more radical amendments and having some help drawing up those so that we could have tried to shift that debate. Because when they're on the order paper, then I can speak to them. If they're not on the order paper, I can't. So it would have been something like that, something around some of the issues around the whole kind of GDP debate and the whole underlying economic system that I've touched on a number of times in what I've said tonight, I suppose. And again, perhaps a greater recognition that that is part of the problem and therefore also part of the solution, looking at alternatives to those whole issues around GDP.
Excellent. Challenge accepted. We're quickly running towards the end of time, but we'll do a quick round of 3 questions. I think that Caroline will be around over wine and nibbles, so I'm sure you can ask her a few more. Yes, definitely. But let's take James and then down at the front. I will take them in 3, so if you ask your question, James, yeah. And if we could keep them short and snappy, I think at this point, that would be great. Thank you.
Caroline, James Wallace, River Action. Our paths crossed 20 years ago when Sustainate was set up, and you were the first politician to back the call for action on climate, if you remember. And it's amazing to think that you weren't even an MP in those days, but people were listening. My question to you is about trust. You said not long ago in government that the government needs to cut the crap when referring to the treatment of our rivers and wildlife and so on. What's your advice, again, if you were the new SOS, or giving advice to the new SOS, what's your advice to them on how parliamentarians can rebuild trust in this world of modern politics?
Great, thanks, James. And then down here at the front, I'll just give you a moment to think about that, Karen. Yeah, of course. That at the front, yeah. The woman, sorry, yeah.
Thank you very much. I work at WWF running their Sustainable Finance Programme, and you've spoken a lot about the power of the ENGO and civil society to change policy and our role in that. In my experience, we've had trouble getting policymakers and ministers listen often without a strong private sector lobby or support behind our suggestions. My question is, what do you see as the role of the private sector in backing what our sector is asking for?
Excellent. And then I can see that Fiona Reynolds has got a hand up just on the end there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caroline, and just joining everybody else's enormous admiration and praise for what you've done. I just wondered if you can reflect for a minute on what legitimises withdrawing from legislative and other commitments that have been made. So you've achieved great things in both nature, 30 by 30, and the carbon targets, and yet politicians feel able to pull back from them, despite evidence of public support. So what can we do, and to what extent, you've mentioned GDP several times, which passionately I agree is one of the causes of the allure of growth without balance sheet or other considerations. What is the advice you'd give us about dealing with that, pulling back from commitments made?
3 really simple and easy questions.
3 incredibly good questions. I mean, maybe going in reverse order. I mean, we haven't talked much about the media tonight, and I think that when I'm Chancellor, and when I've done that, I'm going to move across and then become DCMS, I suppose, because, I mean, there are so many battles to be won, aren't there? But the monopolistic nature of our media means that it's much, much harder to hold politicians to account in that public way. And I do really worry that, that so much of the media is owned by so few people that clearly don't particularly have our interests at heart. And so it does make it much harder then to be able to really put the spotlight on commitments that are then just simply reneged upon, or lies that are told. And in a sense, it links back actually to the first question about trust, because at the moment it feels as if, quite literally, as we've seen in the last few days, that you can go on repeating something that has been shown to be false with no jeopardy. There's no sanction. You can go on saying that Labour's going to put £2,000 worth of taxes on you, and no matter how many different bodies come up saying that is wrong and inaccurate, it still happens because it's perceived to be effective. And I mean, I am struggling, to be very honest, to know quite what we do in that space. I know that my colleague Liz Saville-Roberts, who's the leader of Plaid Cymru in the Parliament, she had a private members bill which was about trying to ensure that politicians were honest. So it literally was a private members bill that would have brought honesty into politics. Sadly, I don't think it got through. To be fair, I don't think it even got as far as getting debated. But we have to find a way to do this. And maybe other people have got ideas in the room, and maybe there are better examples from other legislatures around the world where there is some kind of better sanction for this. But it feels to me that we can all, as informed citizens and as NGOs and as civil society and so on and so forth, we can all try to draw attention to the fact that something that has been agreed has just been simply reneged upon. But unless our voices are amplified and unless there's some kind of sanction at the end of the day, I am struggling very, very honestly to know exactly what we do to hold people properly to account. And maybe over our wine we can discuss the glorious day when we managed to achieve that. And it does speak very much to the issue of rebuilding trust, and that there can be it really matters that people don't have trust in our political system right now and don't trust politicians. the damage that's been done over the last, I mean, it wasn't great, obviously, back in 2010, that was just after the expenses scandal, you know, so it's very easy to perhaps feel that you're being, you know, full of those rose-tinted glasses. It was not great then, for sure. But there's something about what's happened since then, I think, now, where there's this whole sense that politicians are, by definition, out for themselves, and that they really don't care about the public good, and that they are not going to honour what they say, and what they say is probably not true in any case. And it matters because if we're serious about the agenda that we've just been spending the last couple of hours talking about, we're going to need a big state. A big state is going to have a big role in all of this, and if that state isn't trusted, then we've got even more problems. And so it feels to me that, you know, trying to clean up our politics and to find the mechanisms that can begin to hold people to account, and to revise, for example, the ministerial code, so it isn't just the Prime Minister who is the judge and jury over whether or not one of their ministers has broken that code. We saw that with Priti Patel. It was clear she'd broken the code. Boris Johnson, as the Prime Minister of the time, chose not to put any sanction on her. And so the whole edifice falls apart. We need things, I think, like a written constitution. We need to have that widespread political reform so that we can begin to build some of those checks and balances in there. And maybe there is actually also something around a wider electoral system as well that might just mean that you then get different people into Parliament, because there's a good evidence to suggest that actually when you've opened up the political system in that way, you do get different voices. Maybe that could help as well in terms of having people who will inspire some trust rather than corrode it. And then the last question was about the private sector, and thank you for raising that, because I am aware that it was a gap in what I've said tonight. And I do think the private sector has a massively important role to play, and that the private sector, by and large, is miles ahead of most governments. You know, they, in my experience, are crying out for some rules, some certainty, and some consistency. And they don't much care, with some exceptions obviously, but they don't much care about what the rules are, as long as they are clear and they don't change on a weekly basis and they aren't undermined by a whole set of other things happening. So yes, I would love to see the private sector speaking out more in this debate. I think, you know, from time to time you get the letters from the Aldersgate Group or whoever else, and that carries weight, for sure it does. But if there could be some more of that working together and really kind of unleashing the private sector to be a bit more ambitious and to put that in writing and to be much more fierce about that, then maybe that could be an ally with us, at least in some of the direction that we need to go.
Awesome. Thank you, Caroline. I think it's probably nearing time for a glass of wine. So I'm sorry we didn't get time for a few more questions, but I suggest you do so over a glass of wine and some nibbles outside. So really one thing left me to do, and that's to invite Becky Spate, who's the Chief Executive of the RSPB, to come onto stage and say a few words of thanks on behalf of all of us. Becky.
No pressure after that. Caroline, thank you for your speech. And thanks all those who offered reflections and questions from the floor. And it's just my job now to say a big thank you to Caroline from all of us. In your maiden speech to the House, you said that you've been asked the question many times, what can a single MP hope to achieve? And you were clear in your response that a single MP can achieve a great deal. And there's no way, of course, to try to sum up the contribution that you've made to the environmental movement. And we will all always owe you a debt of gratitude. But you have demonstrated how right you were in that first speech. A single MP can achieve a great deal. And your speech tonight was yet another example of the moral courage, the clarity of purpose you bring to our shared mission together. And so, as always, we appreciate your challenge. I hope you'll continue to challenge us wherever your next steps take you. It's genuinely quite hard to imagine what it will be like, a parliament without you in it. For the last 14 years, we have always known that nature and climate would have a voice in you, in the chambers of the House of Commons. But as you said in your speech, we really have come so far. The fact that our issues are now often front page news, I'm looking at the media guys here, they're not always in a good way. And it's not politically acceptable to leave the environment out of the debate, albeit the solutions are often still sadly missing. And that gives us all hope and faith that your work will live on. Caroline, your new book awaits me in the pile by my bed. And I was delighted to be in an audience recently when you spoke about it. You referenced the Charter of the Forest and its links to the modern Right to Roam movement, the poet John Clare, and the potential future role of citizens' assemblies, and these are three of my favourite topics. On a personal note, it is your holistic sense of the history and identity and the strength that gives to the environmental movement, alongside the science, that I have really loved most of all. So I'll end by simply saying thank you from all of us here in this room, and all those not, for what you've achieved, a simply indescribable and overwhelming contribution to the fight for our shared future on this planet together. And that fight, I know, will go on for all of us. The grass below, above the vaulted sky. Caroline, please step forward. And I'd ask all of our friends to be upstanding for Caroline Lucas.